Testing, testing. All right, welcome everyone. Want to start getting everybody settled. We're a few minutes past 7. Let's go ahead and find some seats and we'll get this kicked off. And don't worry, the merchandise table and all of these other tables will be open all night during our break at the middle of the meeting, as well as at the end once the guest presenter is finished. You can also go over and check those out then. We do have a special video to show right before we go into club updates this time, and then we'll have our guest speaker talk to us about Cortinarius. But yeah, we'll hand it over to Rose to introduce this video.
Well, it's a video Trisha and I put together, but Trisha could not be here tonight. But I don't know how many of you know Melody? Raise your hand. So I don't know how Melody, stand up for a second. This is Melody. So Melody has been a member of this club longer than I think anyone else in this room. And she was treasurer for more than 25 years. And she just this year stepped down as treasurer. So we really appreciate everything that Melody has done for the club. And we wanted to put together a video to honor her. And I'm not going to talk because the video explains it all. So enjoy.
Melody was the first person to take me out on a foray and show me how to whisper to the mushrooms. She said, "Here are the woods, go hunt. You should find something out there." She pointed to some red leafy things on the ground. I was like, "Looks like leaves to me." She said, "Look closer, dig a little down." And there I found my first lobster mushroom.
Cliff, how old are you?
I'm 97.
Wow. How long have you known Melody?
I remember her forever.
I know. Well, you could. You have a better memory than I do. I met Melody when she first joined our club, and that would have been in 1996. I was a treasurer at that time, and then a year later in 1997, I actually handed that baton over to Melody, and as we well know, she has been incredibly fabulous treasurer for the past 25 years.
And it was a good club because of her, because she did her duties as treasurer and took care of all that stuff.
Not only was she fabulous at taking out new people in the wilds and showing them all the places to go and how to hunt for mushrooms, but then she'd take them back and she'd teach them how to cook it or how to preserve it.
She is the mushroom whisperer. I mean, that's one of my stories with her is we went out to look for morels before the big morel foray, just to scout things out. And there were like 4 of us in a car, and we're just driving down one of the forest roads outside of Liberty, and we're, it's like 20, 25 miles an hour we're going. And she's in the back seat, and she just screams, "Stop, stop!" Trisha slams on the brakes, and she jumps out and runs right up to a patch of morels.
Wow.
Yeah.
Not only has she been super involved with the South Sound Mushroom Club for so many years, but she's also really involved with our parent organization, the North American Mycological Association. She joined NAMA after the treasurer of NAMA had passed away. They had a spot that needed to be filled, and Steve Bickle suggested that Melody should apply for it. She did, and then she was awarded that position, and she's been the treasurer ever since. So I hear that she once fought off a cougar in the woods while mushroom hunting.
I heard that she faced down a cougar one time.
She and a lady friend were out hiking near the Lake Cushman area, and lo and behold, a cougar actually stepped out in front of Melody on the trail.
She was with somebody else, and the cougar come out there, and they had a walking stick or something, and they just she faced that cougar down. The cougar left and didn't attack them.
The person that was with her had the wherewithal to take pictures of it, while Melody, apparently very calmly, with a very large long stick, kept saying something very soothing to the cougar. And eventually she had to throttle it on the nose and got it to leave. But it was persistent, but she knew exactly what to do. She handled it amazingly well.
But I use this as a story, you know, to illustrate for people that it's not just millennials who are so crazy about their phones that they're taking pictures of everything. I mean, this old woman was doing it too, taking pictures of Melody beating off a cougar.
Because this happened in the 90s, right?
Yeah, it was not that long ago. Not
Well,
that
the
long ago.
1990s are a long time.
Well,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Wait a minute.
She told me about it. I thought, wow, you know, I've been in the woods all my life. I have never saw a cougar in the woods.
An incredible experience. I mean, not many people ever have an encounter like that, and certainly don't always know what to do. So we're pretty proud of her. I've had the pleasure of knowing Melody since she joined SSMC back in 1996. In the recent years, since we both retired, we've spent a lot of time together, and we've had some incredible adventures, including driving across country to go to NAMA forays, stopping along the way at some incredible sites, helping her with quilting projects, learning a lot about just who she was, finding out what an incredibly generous, incredibly kind, and a very available person she is, just to know on a personal level, as well as her expertise with all things mushroom.
And my walking stick. Hand me my walking stick. This was given to me by Melody years ago, and at that time I didn't have a walking stick. I didn't think I needed a walking stick, but Melody knew that I needed one, and now it goes with me everywhere. There's been a couple of times in the
We've
woods.
had to go back to look for it.
Yeah, there's been a couple of times when I've set it down to take pictures or something and had to go back and.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, this is
No.
not just a stick.
She
This is a
made
good
it,
one.
and she handed it to me. I think maybe at Wainucha or something. She just says, "Steve, I think you need it," and I did, and I didn't even know it. So yeah, you can put it back. See, it even has a place inside the house.
A couple weeks ago, I was over at her house, and she's like, "Hey, help me trim my figs," and she showed me how to make new fig trees from fig trimmings, which I don't know why I didn't know you could do that, but now I do know, and I have about 50 baby fig trees, and I have Melody to thank for that.
I think not last year, but the year before, she grew these enormous pumpkins, and
Oh, yeah.
it's just incredibly beautiful. And of course, we could barely move it, so it has to be sledgehammered open in order to be able to cook it down and use it. But I mean, just wonderful things like that. She really is a great gardener. She grows beautiful rhubarb and lots of other wonderful garden vegetables.
She's also got her cute backyard chickens.
Yeah, she does. She's got chickens and eggs, and she's always cooking up something delicious. Oh, her candy cap cake.
Yeah, she's a
Oh.
phenomenal cook. We should talk about some of the
Oh.
food that she's made for our potlucks or our retreats.
Oh, the woman is just, it seems endless with what she's able to dish up. You know, the original club cookbook was created eons ago, it seems, and one of our club members named Joe Tillman was the illustrator of the book, which is, by the way, delightful. If no one has purchased one, they really should. And Melody contributed recipes. I'm quite certain many other people did too. But in the past year or two, we needed to reprint the cookbook because we had run out. And so she was able to contact Joe Tillman and get the copyright licensing again so that we could reprint it.
I ran across that cookbook just the other day. I was going through my stuff and I ran across that cookbook. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. can she cook? Oh, she makes these incredible dishes and uses all the wonderful, dried mushrooms, fresh mushrooms. We have a lot of fun experimenting and eating all of the goodies that she makes. But I think the candy cap cake, one of the
Yeah.
finest, in my opinion.
I guess it was one of the December potlucks, and I had come over to her house because she and I were going to carpool, and she was making it, and it just smelled so good. I was like, oh, this is incredible. I can't wait to try it. And we got there, and I remember, we were milling around. I was chatting with people, and I was like, oh, yeah, the cake. And I went to get some, and it like hadn't even been out on the table 10 minutes, and it was gone.
I think Chanterelles was her favorite. I'm not sure.
We went out one time. I was showing her and a couple other women from the club one of the trails that I like to walk on. We were just going to different places scouting for chanterelles, and we were walking down the trail, and we weren't finding anything or much. We would each find like 1 or 2 chanterelles, and just having a good time on a beautiful day in the fall in the woods walking down the trail. But Melody decided she'd had enough, and she just stopped and she just announced, ladies, we can walk in the woods or we can hunt mushrooms. And that was that. We all turned around and went back to the car and tried a different place. We were having a good time, but we did find more mushrooms later. She knew they weren't there.
She's the mushroom whisperer.
She knew they weren't there. Yeah.
She makes really yummy pickled chanterelles.
Yes.
She gave me a jar of pickled chanterelles once, and they were pretty good.
One day she showed up at our house with some chanterelles.
That's the Melody we all love.
Yeah.
We really bonded when Microflora project came along, and I think that was about 2018.
She was an inspiration for Steve Ness in order to create the first Microflora project, which was at that time spearheaded also through NAMA's affiliation.
One other thing that maybe should be mentioned too, and that is her role at the national level with NAMA. She's treasurer of NAMA too. She's got her ear to everything that they do,
Yeah.
and we're
That's how she brought
first
the
to know
Microflora.
about
She
what.
heard about it at NAMA and brought it to us because it wasn't coming through the regular channels.
3 projects came out of it. One was for Romaria, which was actually all because of Melody.
The Romaria project was started by Melody.
And we had to get money for it because we were going to spend about $1,000 in doing sequencing. And so once again, at the big house, she had created a beautiful quilt and we raffled it off.
I just can't say enough about her support of sequencing project for the South Sound Mushroom Club. It was that support from the board and from Melody. Melody was a big push back then. It was made sequencing so exciting for me. It's just changed my whole world. So
The real thing behind starting the Microflora project with us was that it put us on the map. And we were able to become known not only locally, but we became nationally and internationally known for the capabilities we had of not only finding unique species, but also being able to have them DNA sequenced.
actually, the very first real surprise in a extension of habitat was a mushroom found by Melody on the Evergreen campus, and we sent it in, and it came back as Hygrocybe redii, and that was the first time it had been found this side of the Mississippi.
And
I was
the
with
first
me.
observation here in Washington was made by Melody. Huh?
It was made by Melody, and I was with her on that parade, and it was such a fun parade. And Melody she says, I found, she was back behind this great big old stump, kind of down back in a hole, and she said, Steve, I think you should look at this one. I didn't. The last thing in the world I expected was the species that it came back.
redii, you said?
Redii, Reidii. Yeah, I'm not.
Okay.
That was a real fun one too, and it was fun because Melody was because she didn't know. Well, none of us knew, you know. Was this anything? Steve, is this anything? I didn't have a clue. But luckily we sequenced it.
Yeah.
We grabbed it, we dried it, we sequenced it, and we got a good sequence out of it. So yeah. Melody finds the mushroom, listen to her. That's the takeaway from that.
It really created a whole new world for a lot of members who were slightly interested. And at this point, they decided, oh, yeah, I could become a citizen, a scientist, and I could help.
Yeah, I would say for such a small club, we have made a huge impact on mycology.
Yes.
I mean, we're doing big things.
Yes.
And it's really amazing when you think about it. Like, Melody is in the background for all of those big changes and
Yes.
accomplishments.
Yep.
She's a driving force.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Knowledge.
For sure.
And, just open to sharing her knowledge, which so many mushroom hunters are not.
Melody has been the backbone of our club, I believe, for these last 25, 26 years. And the reason I can say that with great certainty is that she's seen the club ebb and flow, and we've gone from sometimes as low membership as 30 people up to where we are now, which I think is approaching 500. And during that time, it takes stability to keep the club motivated.
Tell us about this cross-country road trip to the Northwoods Foray in 2017.
Oh, that was really fun. That was Corinne, Melody, Steve Bickle, and myself, and the four of us in one car driving from Olympia all the way out there. So we said, well, if we're going to go all the way, then we need to enjoy some sights along the way. And then, of course, when we got to the Foray, that was an amazing event. And there's some pictures that I think we've sent along which show just how remarkable it was. In 2021, I actually wrote a proposal and a recommendation for Melody to win the Knighton Award. And with the help of various other members of the club who gave some wonderful background information about the way Melody had contributed so generously and so significantly to our club, as well as to NAMA. She actually won that award, and I'm very happy for her because it's an incredibly prestigious award to win. Melody and I decided we were going to go to Colorado.
Well, that was two
years ago. That was 2 years ago. So we decided, well, why not? Let's drive again. So the two of us drove all the way from Olympia to Colorado. But what was cute was that Corinne joined us at one point, as did Barbara Chin. So we had a little threesome of cars going up into the very, very, very high mountains, which none of us were prepared for. And there's some pictures of us when we got to the top. But along the way, Barbara Chin got lost. Corinne didn't feel well. And when we got to the very top, we were all pooped. But the foray itself was sort of okay, but we didn't find as many mushrooms as we'd hoped. But our trip itself was a kick.
Well, you have that photo you sent me with all those Boletus rubiceps you picked, so it wasn't a total bust. It looked like you had tasty dinner at least one night.
We did, and I must say that was all we found. but we had a great time, and it was fun to do.
And I have a few pictures of Melody at Paul Smith's. I think Melody and I believe we were the only two representatives from Southtown Mushroom Club at that event, but it was all the way in upstate New York. I don't think you could get any further away from Washington State.
And now Southtown Mushroom Club has their own spring extravaganza.
Right, yeah, Spring Mushroom
Festival.
Festival. You know, that was Melody's idea. People like to give me credit for that, but it was her idea. She was the one that pushed for it. She just didn't want to be the one in charge
Well,
of
yeah,
it.
you're the one that made it happen. But it was her idea, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Melody.
She just has a way of reaching people that, boy, not very many people do. She's a leader in a quiet way. She's a leader in a quiet way, and she's a good friend. I mean, I feel really lucky to count her amongst my friends.
I think Melody did a lot of things for the club, and she was our backbone for the club quite a bit there.
Oh boy, thanks Melody for
Yeah.
all you contributed to the club. I mean, the club is what it is today because of your inspiration and your leadership. Yeah.
Yeah, well, she's welcome at my house anytime.
I appreciate how Melody is always willing to take me out into the woods and includes me in her mushrooming adventures across the country. Melody, you are a wonderful person and a great friend. Thank you for teaching me the mushroom ways.
Melody, would you like to stand up real quick? And everyone, this is the Melody of legend. And thank you everyone for being part of that and watching that tribute to Melody. Who here has been part of the club for less than 5 years? Less than 2? Yeah, so it's a long and storied club. It's been around for decades, and Melody's been there for a very large chunk of that. So we appreciate everything she's done and the groundwork that she laid for the club. And a lot of the people you saw in that video have also been around for a long time and helped make this club what it is today. So thank you, all of you, and thank you, Melody. And with that, we will, and also big thank you to Rose and Trisha for putting together that lovely video. There was a lot of work that went into that, so thank you. And with that, we'll go ahead and get into our regular programming. I just have a few short club updates. I think maybe we'll do the raffle at the end, so we can get our guest speaker up here a little sooner. So welcome. And Cadell, can we get the agenda? Okay, so during club updates, just want to give some information on upcoming events that we have and a couple opportunities. There's one more short award that we'll have to present. And as I said, we'll do the raffle at the end and then get our guest speaker up here to tell us about the genus Cortinarius. So next general meeting is in a month, Tuesday, May 16th at 7 p.m. Our own Katie Thompson will be giving a lecture on Morels 101. This is our last general meeting of the season. We take a break from these general meetings during the summer. We haven't the past couple of years because pandemic, but this year we will be taking a break. So this will be the last general club meeting until September. So mark your calendars for that. Also note that Katie will be giving her Morel lecture at our spring festival, which I'll talk about in just a second. So we are taking a break from general meetings during the summer. We've talked about having some workshops. So stay tuned for that as we plan that. Otherwise, big upcoming event in a week and a half now. Saturday, April 29th is our second annual Spring Mushroom Festival here at the church out in the field over there. If you got to join last year, it was great fun. We had vendors, an ID table, cooking demos, presentations, kids craft area. It was a ton of fun. So we hope you can join us again. If you're interested in the cooking demos, the whole festival is free, but if you would like to be part of the cooking demos with Chef Graham, we have a spot on our website now for signing up for those classes. It's $15 per class, and I think he's doing 3, a breakfast, hors d'oeuvre or lunch, and dinner. So check out our website for that registration. And also, we will have an ID table. Some of our members and volunteers will be bringing some mushrooms to show off. But please feel free, if you find some cool stuff before then and you want to have it identified, bring it to the ID table. We'll have a bunch of our own experts there to help you identify those. So yeah, please come. It's a lot of fun. We also, another big event coming up is our annual Morel Foray, which is a little later this year due to the wacky weather. But it will be June 9th through the 11th. And it's right outside of not right outside, a little outside of Ellensburg, at the Lazy F Camp and Retreat Center. And we have, I think registration is actually live as of today or yesterday. So be on the lookout for that very soon. At the retreat center, there are options to camp or sleep in bunks, or hook up an RV, spend the whole weekend. And if you buy, the package instead of just coming out for the day, it includes meals as well for the whole weekend. So there will be more information on that on our website. So check or stay tuned for that. And more information will be available soon. I think a lot of information went out in the members newsletter yesterday. But in addition to that, we'll have the registration link very soon. Okay. Yeah. I don't believe so. No, that's not a burn foray. It's just an area that we got to scope out last year. We'll be returning there. Good question. So there's also, I alluded to it at the last meeting, there's North American Mycological Association scholarship that we might be able to go for as a club and get, help send someone to the annual national foray. So we're still hashing out the details on that, but if that seems like something that you'd be interested in, Rose is the one coordinating that. She is over there running the raffle. And then just a short plug, we always need volunteers. Thank you to those of you who have already signed up to volunteer at the Spring Festival or for other things. Please reach out if you're interested. We always need foray leaders. You don't have to be an expert, just know the basics and work with our foray coordinator, Regina, if you'd like to help lead one. Also, we usually have a library where people can check out mushroom books, and Kitty, our in-house mushroom librarian, has requested some backup for that if anyone's interested in helping. So there are a lot of different opportunities. So please reach out if you think this is something that you would like to do. And finally, we just have one more award and we will move on with our guest presentation. So this is being presented by former President Rachel Friedman.
Thank you, Rachel. So every year, the president of the South Sound Mushroom Club selects a member of the board who has stood out amongst the team. Typically, most of you might know that this award is given in December, but due to circumstances and schedules and snowstorms that didn't arrive, it's taken me until now to make this award. Let's keep going. I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that Rose Tercey is the recipient of the 2022 President's Award. Oh, she's surprised. She did so much, even though Melody had the idea for the spring show, spring festival. Rose single-handedly pulled that one together. She also last month received the Order of the Mushroom. So Rose is really a highly valued member of our club. And I just want to continue on that kind of accolade. She wears many hats and she's engaged in many activities. She's an author, an illustrator, an artist, a visual arts expert, and she uses her talents to promote our club in many ways. She's written articles about the South Sound Mushroom Club. She served as vice president with me. She maintains our social media account, which, by the way, if you have photos, send to Rose because she's always interested in, posting what you've found. She's led many forays, both for our club as well as other organizations, all ages. She's great with kids. She was basically, as I said, helped single-handedly pull off the 2022 Mushroom Festival. She basically uses her art to create a lot of things fungi. So she's going to be a vendor at our spring festival this year. So take a look at her booth. I think you'll find some stuff. So with that, would you please help me thank Rose for being a wonderful 2022 President Award recipient. Thank you, Rose. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to our volunteers and board and everyone who makes this club as wonderful as it is. So I think maybe we'll just take a couple minutes to let our guest speaker get set up. So take a quick break. Like I said, we'll do the raffle afterwards just so we can keep moving. But yeah, come back in a couple minutes and we will get started with our guest presentation. Thank you. If everybody could please take their seats again. We're gonna continue with our program. All of this stuff will be here after our guest presenter is done. So don't worry, there'll be more time to check out the merch and look at the books we have and all that kind of stuff. All right, so I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Shannon Adams. She is a UX researcher in the tech industry who has a passion for the genus Cortinarius. When she emigrated from Australia 20 plus years ago, she was struck by the diversity and beauty of Cortinarius species she saw in the Washington Cascades and started trying and failing to identify them. For the past 6 years, she's been collecting and documenting species in the region and has over 1,000 Cortinarius collections in her personal herbarium. In 2021, she led publication of a new Cortinarius species. I'll allow you to elaborate on that one and pronounce it. Whatever your expertise, Shannon is here to inspire you to get out and learn about mushrooms. Thank you, Shannon, for joining us tonight.
Let me just check I've got this right. Okay, everyone hear me okay? Okay, so I want to confess I'm a little intimidated after seeing the movie and hearing the intro about your club's sequencing. So, you know, my background is not in biology. I'm not a scientist. And everything I've done here is as a community scientist. So starting from pretty much chanterelles, morels, to Cortinarius taxonomy. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. You know, starting at the beginning, the saucepan and how I got increasingly into the science. So just, I'm curious today, who here has a science background? Who's had the luxury? You got a lot of folks? Yeah, okay. So you guys are going to kind of, the beginning of this talk might actually be, you know, I know this stuff. This is stuff that's familiar to me. But later on, I'm interested to really challenge people here to pay attention to Cortinarius. Because, you know, if anyone's ever been to a show, they are among the least identified mushrooms. They're pretty, but we pass over them because they're considered difficult, the problem children for the identification person at the table. But it's not impossible. And really, Cortinarius is one of a unique number of genera that has been well studied by scientists and has a very good genetic data set available with names on it. So it's uniquely set up for people like us who maybe have a part-time, actually willing to get out in the field to make a contribution to science. So let's get going though. Okay, so I started with the pot. This was one of my you know, end of a day's foraging, a nice quiche here. This one is actually black trumpets from the East Coast, a few chives thrown in from the garden. And this is what really got me started. I had kids here in America. As you can hear from my accent, I was from overseas, born in South Africa, lived in Australia for many years. I came to Seattle and I just couldn't believe the amazing diversity of mushrooms that we came across. Okay, let's see if we can make the next one come. Yeah, there we go. So, you know, these kind of pictures, these are from my kids who were in a Waldorf school. And, you know, we used to go out and just collect mushrooms. At first, I didn't know what they were. And so it was quite difficult to go out with a guidebook and feel confident. But, you know, increasingly, I started to focus on, you know, the more familiar mushrooms you can see there, the winter chanterelles, the boletes, and a bit of a delay here I've got with this. There we go. You can see here just on the side of the road. This was one very good year. We had amazing Boletus edulis growing in Seattle. And this is just on the side of the road. I saw an oak tree. And as you start to collect mushrooms to eat, you start to realize the ecology is really important and you become a little bit, you're suspicious. You see an oak tree, you might want to stop, because that's, those kind of conditions. In the fall around here, you may just find boletes in the urban environment. Fire morels. Here again, in the spring, this was a really good introduction for me. It was things that I could start to identify pretty easily. There are very few toxic lookalikes, or there's nothing really that, you could mistake these for. And here's actually a photograph of my dad and my dachshund. Note to anyone who's considering buying a dog, a dachshund is not a good mushrooming companion. They have trouble with logs. But very good on roads like this. And here we are, we're just speaking to a picker and trying to understand, where are these things? We did not get many. We ended up buying a few pounds, I think, from some of the picker camp. But, it takes time. And after, a few years, I started to get the hang of it. And you can see there on the bottom left, just some of the morels we got that year. But after a while, I started to realize there were a lot of things other than the edibles, a lot of really interesting stuff on the table. And, after any kind of fall foray, I'm sure your club has a table like this with a whole lot of diversity on it. And I started to say, what are these things that I haven't seen? And in this case, there were a lot of Cortinarius, a great number of Cortinarius. And yet, when I asked our ideas about them, they often told me, we don't identify these things. These are not... I'm really having trouble. Oh, we don't put names on the Cortinarius. And I was started to say, why not? What is going on here? Could we maybe do a little better? So I got really curious about starting to say, what are the Cortinarius that we have in our area? And what are these things? In a way, though, I was at a real disadvantage from the beginning, because anyone here has been a birder? Yeah, so we've got a few birds. If you see a bird, you've can find the guidebook, and you can look through the pages, or you can turn up the app, and every bird that we have in our region is in the book. So really the challenge that you have is just to find the right match. It's very different with mushrooms. I mean, if anyone's new to mushrooming, you might not realize it, but most of our mushrooms are not in the guidebooks. So if you're looking through something, you find something a little unusual, it probably isn't in the book. And that makes it very difficult for genera like Cortinarius or, Hygrophorus or Hygroscibes or some of these, or Russula in particular, some of these large genera or more or less studied genera, just not in the guidebook. So you're not going to be able to get to ID by simply doing the right thing and looking through the book. So what can we do? And that's when I got really interested in identification of Cortinarius. So, I started a project much like you guys, a fundus project, a fundy, project of mycoflora to try and identify and collect Cortinarius. And I'm going to just start by telling you what are Cortinarius, because I bet some of you here aren't really familiar with that. So Cortinarius is part of the family Cortinariaceae. And I'm intentionally talking about the family because there have been changes coming up in the taxonomy, which might mean that we split what we know today as Cortinarius. So today, Cortinariaceae, this family has only one genus. There's another one in it called Stephanopoulos, I think it's called that, which actually isn't genetically founded. So, for now, we're just saying that there's just genus Cortinarius. There are thousands of species. Some people estimate 5,000 species in the genus. And, here, over 400. They have a global distribution, and they are ectomycorrhizal. But what are the actual features? If someone was out there in the field and wants to know, hey, this is a Cortinarius, how would you recognize it? Let's see. So they have a veil, and that's the definitive feature of the genus. So a cortina or veil. Think of a kind of a cobwebby structure. And it's also terrestrial, as I said, and has a silky or fibrillose stipe. And also importantly, it has a rusty brown spore deposit. Some people say orange brown, some people say a warm brown, but it's those characteristics are the key features that you want to be looking for. And we're going to see quite a few examples. If you look at this, this picture here, you can see that the cortina may actually be in two parts. There's the inner and the outer cortina. And that took me many years to realize that. So if we go, to another photograph, we might be able to see the inner veil. Yeah, this fine cobwebby veil. And in some cases also a thicker outer veil. To make 4 clicks for every slide here. So there you go. Whoops. Okay, you can see here, this is the thick cortina, the thick kind of white outer veil. And both of these kind of, you know, this cortina concept of these threads that you see joining the outside of the rim of the mushroom to the stipe is really an important feature to look for, as well as that rusty brown kind of spore deposit that you see on the stipe. And a lot of my photographs I'm going to show you today have that kind of spore deposit, and it's something you really should be looking out for. But, you know, as well as those simple features, there's a huge amount of diversity in the genus. So if you can see, all of these photographs here are different Cortinarius. And there's some that are bright red. That one's actually from Australia. There's some that are kind of pinkish with a very bright reaction. There's some that are dull and brown, and there's some that are purple. So with so much variation, how could you recognize them? You know, how can you come to be confident that you've got a Cortinarius? So we're going to look at that a little bit now and start with the basics of how you might identify a Cortinarius. Firstly, why bother? You know, why are we bothering with identifying Cortinarius today? I've basically come up with sort of 3 reasons as I've spoken to hundreds of people about this genus. The first one is, hey, I want to eat mushrooms. Can I eat them? The bad news is probably not, but there are some important species to get to know. The second group of people might be some folks here who want to just recognize more mushrooms as you're out in the woods. You know, you're just curious. You see them, they're beautiful, and you just have that need to kind of identify a few more. And certainly Cortinarius is an important genus for you because there's so many of them out there. Odds are in fall, if you're out any day, you're going to see dozens of Cortinarius. And finally, maybe this club seems to be very interested in taxonomy. And so it's a really awesome genus to be working on because of the great collaboration that there's been globally around describing them, and because of the amount of work there is yet to do. So if you're interested in describing new species or contributing to scientific papers, there's a very high chance of you doing so with Cortinarius. In fact, in the recent survey we did sequencing recently in the Spring Mycota project, over 10% of the mushrooms I collected had no public database record before. So, I mean, that's a really high odds. So, you know, how do you identify them if you're just getting started? For first one, you want to identify the few edible species. So let's say, what are the edible Cortinarius out there? Does anyone have any that you're familiar with? Any names? Edible Cortinarius. This one, Cortinarius violaceus. I don't eat it. It tastes a little muddy to me, but it is edible. So it's a fairly unique species. It's not something I recommend people go out there and collect for food. But if you are interested in tasting a range of species, this is one that is edible. Cortinarius violaceus is a really special species because it is the type species. It was the first Cortinarius that was described by Linnaeus back in the 1700s. And so, you know, it is definitive of the genus Cortinarius. Very easy to identify. You can see here this spore color that I mentioned, this rusty brown spore deposit, the purple gills. This is one of the most common mushrooms we see coming into the show. So, you know, everybody here with a little bit of attention should be able to identify this one just because it's so different. So Cortinarius violaceus is one of the 2 edible species I'm going to mention. And you can see here, again, all of these rusty spore deposits that are a really good clue that you've got a Cortinarius in front of you. Any ideas on the second edible Cortinarius? It's, it's Cortinarius caparatus. Now, often people don't talk about caparatus as an edible species because it's really not a beginner's mushroom, because it has, you know, there are other mushrooms that you could mix it up with and make a mistake. But that said, let's look at the basics of it. It's really interesting to see the cap as the first feature. So the cap has this wrinkled, if we can see it up here, kind of a wrinkled, folded character. And it also has a really distinctive annulus. And as young specimens, you get to see this powdery coating on the young fruit bodies. And there are quite a number of people in our area who really love eating this mushroom. It used to be called the gypsy. It's sometimes called the wrinkled court, but it's actually was called caparatus or earlier rosides. So have a look for this in guidebooks if you're seeing something like this in fall. And remember, you want to see that annulus. People often make mistakes and misdiagnose it because of the, because of lookalikes. But let's just have a look at some of those lookalikes. You can see here, this is actually, you can see the annulus, that like skirt-like annulus on this one as well. Okay. So here we've got an example from iNaturalist. I'm just curious, folks, do you think this is Cortinarius caparatus? What's the concern? Okay, just have a look here. I'm going to show you, it's a good point because it's quite subtle, but there it is. It is actually there. So this one is, I think, Cortinarius caparatus. The next one, also Cortinarius caparatus. You see there that the annulus is a little fine, but it's still quite horizontal. It's not hanging down. It's not feathery. So I'm just giving you examples here so that you can start to key in on the features. And it does take time. You know, it took me several years before I started to really eat this mushroom. Here again, a third one. This one I don't think is caparatus. You can see there's no annulus at all. There's no little bit of tissue left on the stipe. Also, you can see that the spore deposit has fallen down on the stipe in a really streaky way. Typically on caparatus, because of the annulus, that doesn't happen. So yeah, there's no like band over here. So that is not Cortinarius caparatus. And here's another one. This was also labeled Cortinarius caparatus. I'm really worried about this one. And this is an example of why it's not a beginner's mushroom, because this is actually an amanita. Whether or not it's a toxic amanita doesn't really matter. The fact is that people could identify Cortinarius caparatus as an amanita and muddle them up to that extent, just as a warning sign that you've got to be careful with eating this kind of Cortinarius species, and why it's not a beginner's mushroom, even though it's really good once you get the hang of it. So, you know, that division about being able to differentiate mushrooms from each other is one of the most important features of when you're going to eat things. It's not just say, hey, I think this is an edible mushroom, or I think this is a toxic mushroom, but how can we actually differentiate between them? And so, you know, when I first started, I had a lot of trouble with it. Here, I really struggled with these two. I still remember being out on the Hood Canal on my own, one of my first falls, and going, is this a gill or a fold? You know, the big mystery of chanterelles when you're a beginner. It's not always obvious. And in the same way, we get a lot of confusion in Cortinarius because there's so many mushrooms. There's so many purple mushrooms. And so I remember talking to David Aurora once about Cortinarius and which could be eaten. And he said, I think a lot of the purple Cortinarius are edible, simply because people muddle them up and think they're bluets all the time. And so, you know, if these things were toxic, we'd be getting a lot more bluet poisonings. So let's have a look at some of those purple species. Here we have on the left, Cortinarius olympianus. And on the right, you've got a Clitosobe nuda or bluet. So just take a moment and look at that. You can see how someone who's relatively new to ID could make a mistake. Have the same curved cap, the similar colors, particularly when moist. So how could we differentiate these? You know, if anyone got any ideas, what are we looking for there? Yeah, the spores, and it also at the base of the stipe. Do you see the bulb on the Cortinarius? A lot of Cortinarius have these sort of nice bulbous bases. The stipe has this really kind of swollen base, or it could be very firm, and it just is slightly different to the Clitosobe. Another example. Let's see if we can get this. Yeah, here's another example. On the left here, we have a different species of Cortinarius, probably one that's familiar to some of you. It's called Cortinarius triganus. It's a really distinctive species. Who feels that you could identify Cortinarius triganus? Anyone? Yes. I'm super excited. This can be an interesting one to identify, and I'd love everyone here to be able to raise their hand. And so I'm going to give you some clues about that in a moment. But just have a look here again at these two, purple. And so a lot of people think that that's the main feature. But when you look at the gill color again, and also the flesh color, you can start to differentiate them. So let's see if we can look at those in a bit more detail. Here you've got 4 different species of purple Cortinarius. Yeah, 4 different ones. And I'm going to just show you where they are. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. So what we've got here, this is actually all up in Alaska, where they have large numbers of Cortinarius in the fall. On the left, we've got Sailor, and this one's slippery. The cap's slippery, so that's how you can differentiate it. On the back, you've got Cortinarius occidentalis, which bruises purple. In the middle, we've got Cortinarius camphoratus, which actually is one of the most commonly collected Cortinarius for this particular club's region, for around the Olympia region. And on the right, Cortinarius triganus. Triganus is one that can be easily identified because its flesh is always this reddish brown color, this kind of ochre red, and the gills are never purple. So if we look on, typically on iNaturalist, there's always a number of Cortinarius triganus misidentified because people don't recognize that they never have a purple phase. So if they have purple gills, you might consider Cortinarius camphoratus. But if you can see on the right here, there's this rusty brown gill color on the Cortinarius triganus, whereas all of the others have a pale or purple gill phase. Also, there's an odor. Cortinarius odors are really interesting. Some of them are quite stinky, some of them are sharp, some of them have this sort of a herbaceous odor. And in this case, Cortinarius triganus smells slightly pear-like or fruity, whereas camphoratus is apparently quite stinky. Some people call it like dirty socks or goaty, a goaty smell. Anyway, it's unpleasant enough that people sometimes jumping in my car will kind of hold their noses and pull a face and ask me to leave it behind. So, in addition to the kind of confusion you can have around purple Cortinarius, there are also some really poisonous species. So not so many in our area that are highly toxic, but certainly Cortinarius rubellus has led to some serious poisonings because it contains aurelaniine and can cause renal failure. And so this is why Cortinarius aren't considered, a trial and error kind of mushroom. There's species that have been treated with some concern simply because some of them have these, really dangerous toxins. We could hypothesize that that's particularly certain sections, but, who wants to take a chance when there are some really serious consequences? And there have been, a few fatalities from species containing these chemical compounds. And in addition, there's a second species, click, come on. The Cortinarius aurelanus, which is found in North America and has been associated with a fatality with people who ate it thinking that it was, some kind of button mushroom and ate in large number and ended up in hospital with renal failure. So moving aside from eating, generally the message you probably got is you can eat a few of them, but majority are not going to be your favorite edibles. So what can we do? How can we improve ID just out of interest and curiosity? So let's see. How many Cortinarius are there? This is a matter of great debate. If you looked at Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, which is probably our biggest guidebook, they have about 102 species mentioned. But when we look at iNaturalist, so there's already 169 species. And if we look at Danny Miller's lists, which is based on sequence data known in Washington, adjacent areas close by, we have over 400, about 430 known species of Cortinarius in our state. And how many do we name? How many names do we use on our shows? 10, maybe 20? So there's opportunity here. And sequencing is really vital in this effort for us to get a concept, to know what these things look like and to reclaim names that are out there. So, let's have a look at what's been seen in our area. The first here is just from iNaturalist, showing sort of observations of Cortinarius I drew a kind of a quadrant a little bit bigger than the Olympia area. And you can see that these are the top 10 species concepts that we're using. But remember, what's seen and recorded on iNaturalist is really not representative of what's actually out there because it's what catches our eye. They're really bright, colorful, maybe more long-lived things that get reported. And also iNaturalist requires us to have a name for it to really rank. So you're having a lot of things that are easy to identify, but the vast majority of mushrooms are actually not ranked in this way. So, of those top 10, how many can we identify? Remember, this is just for those of us who want to identify a few more Cortinarius and have them in our repertoire. So there's Cortinarius violaceus, the one that we mentioned before. Just reminding you that this is a really dark purple and its cap's got this scaly, fuzzy look to it. So you could, really get to be quite familiar with this, and you could even eat it if you're interested in trialing it out. Bearing in mind, I'm not recommending it. You've got Cortinarius triganus. Again, reminder, you've got this reddish flesh, and even the young girls are this red ochre brown. They're never purple. So those are two species that we can easily identify. Everybody can become familiar with them. But things get a bit kind of difficult after that. You have here the Demosibes. And Demosibes is really familiar and valued for people who do fabric dyeing. I bet we've got some folks here who do fabric dyeing or interested in knitting. Anyone do dyeing with our mushrooms? You? No, a few. Well, this section of Cortinarius are really valuable for fabric dyeing because they have water-soluble pigments that take on animal fibers. And so you can see those bright colored gills. Often those represent the colors that you'll get if you dye, say, wool or cotton. However, there are hundreds of these species, or not, maybe not hundreds, there are dozens of species here, and very few are actually well identified. So if you see mushrooms that are extremely brightly colored, here's an example of one of them that's known from our area, Cortinarius birkbackii. I don't see this name used often, but it can look quite red, a reddish with some brown streaking. And this is a species that grows around Puget Sound, often in sort of coastal forests, and, you know, something worth keeping a lookout for. It's slightly more slender than the very brilliant red ones, but it's a name that we could actually be using. And then there's lots of others. You've got here, you know, this is probably, we'd normally call this Croceus, but when I sequence it, it's called Olivaceo fuscus. There are just so many of these. Whenever I did another few, you can see these 3 different species that come up as close to one called Malacorius. Sounds a bit like sort of an evil character in a Disney movie, Princess Malacorius. But look at that. There's 3. They look very similar. We'd probably put them on the table and call them Cortinarius cinnamomius. But look how much variety there is out there for us to discover. And these are just, you know, 5% different or a few percent different to any known species concept. So I haven't been able to put a name on them yet. And I only have one collection of each, so it's not enough to actually do much work on. Another sort of section that you can start to learn if you're interested in more ID is leprosody. And again, this is an area that's had a ton of work on recently. And so it's at a state where, even though it's not in the guidebook, there's a really good paper, a really good key that you can work through and get to ID of species in this group. So how do you recognize them? Scaly capped. And if you've got a UV light, they UV fluoresce. So anyone who's interested in taking photos for Instagram, these are favorites. You can put them again, a bit of dark velvet, shine the UV light, and they go incredible colors. And that also tells you that you've got a leprosody. Because of course, we're also looking at the spore color and that slightly scaly cap, sometimes a little bit of cortina. And then we can use this paper and pretty much you can actually get to, we can actually go through this key and we can get to species ID. So Cortinarius in these particular sections does not have to be as incomprehensible or as high a bar as people sometimes think. And, you know, I've put these all in a drive. So if anyone wants all these papers, happy to share the drive. You want to identify a leprosody that you find in the field, go for it. These are names that we can claim and start to use in our area. And one of my collections from High Steel Bridge actually ended up being in this paper when we described the leprosodies. And you can see here it is. This is from up near Steve's area. This one was just collected by the road on a rather wet and soggy fall day. And it's a new species that was described a couple of years ago called Cortinarius aterosquamosus. And this one is not exactly aterosquamosus, so they're saying it's affiliated with it. And we have yet to decide if it's a new species or just a part of that species concept. In the same way, you can go through a lot of different sections in Cortinarius and have keys and identification. Sorry, we're just struggling here. You know, for example, multiformis. I'm sure everyone has seen some Cortinarius like this. It's got this orange cap, really pale gills. Those are all the same group. In the same way, the Cortinarius variosimilis is another really easy to describe species. You can see it has that same kind of brownish cap, but it's got this yellow reaction on the flesh when you put a bit of a chemical on it. So in these areas, we've got difficult species, but they're easier to identify once you start to recognize characteristics of a group. So for example, again, the Damascene with those bright colored gills with the furry caps, like we saw earlier, that was used for dyeing. The Leprosebe have the scaly caps and the UV positivity. And then we have Multiformis with the brownish cap and the white gills. So after a while, you start to think of them each rather than as one whole genus. Think of them as sections or groups which have similar characteristics. Then we can then key out to species once we get close enough. That's really what I'm suggesting as a strategy, rather than going out there saying, I want to identify that as the white-crested crowned lesser spotted sparrow. Say, hey, that's a sparrow. You know, this is a parrot. The Damascenes are the parrots. And then we've got some maybe like sparrow-like ones coming up. Once we get to those kind of groups, we can start to get to names secondarily. So, you know, just a few more, I won't go into too much detail, but a few more sections. This is called the Purpuricenti, just a purple group. And these are interesting because if you touch them, they bruise purple. So if you see a purple mushroom, bit of a slimy cap, got the cinnamon red spores, you touch it, it bruises purple. And you can say, oh, I found one of the Purpuricenti. And it's easier to ID once we've got to that section. In this case, a lot of these species aren't named. So it's not like you're actually failing to identify. You're getting as close as possible until we get further work done. Yeah, let's see another. This is one of my favorite sections. These ones are highly viscid. So slippery. Viscid means that they've got this layer of moist gluten on the surface. It's kind of mucus-like. And I know some people don't like the word moist, so I get great pleasure in saying moist, moist, moist a lot when we talk about this particular section. But they are the kind of mushroom that people notice because it's so slippery. Particularly in rainy weather, you can sometimes lift a little bit of that gluten up and it'll form a long thread, you know, sometimes like this long. And also the stipe of these is also viscid. So you have particularly kids over there, if you find these, have a lot of fun with them because they're like super slippery, sluggy mushrooms. What we found out is that these same features have sometimes emerged in different sections. So while for identification purposes, we say, oh, these are all the slippery ones, then we have to notice, do they have purple on? Or are they all brown? Are they bitter? And we start to explore them a bit more. But just for the purposes of becoming more familiar with Cortinarius and taking the next step, this is probably the feature that you should look for in this section, slippery, moist, with still having those cinnamon brown spores. Here's one actually that was that Steve emailed me about a few years ago because he found a collection of this. This is Cortinarius bruneo albus, described in the last, say, 4 or so years from our area. It's quite a short one and it doesn't have any purple on. So super slippery, shortish, no purple. Cortinarius bruneo brown albus. And then, you know, you can see here how these different species are grouped together. This is what when we do the work with the sequencing, you can start to group them and you'll start to see the different species concepts. Both of these groups that you can see on the left here, Diffibularium mixaceum, both of these are groups of mushrooms which fit together in a section or a species, species within a section, but they're actually, you know, in a separate section, but they both have this feature, this really viscid, slippery kind of characteristic. Here's Steve's example that he found in this area. And you can see here that, you know, you've got that really shiny kind of slippery cap that hopefully everybody will recognize when you see it in the field. Similarly, you know, we've had the same kind of development happen in Cortinarius section Anomaly. Anomaly are all these little mousy lilac mushrooms. So remember, we've got ectomycorrhizal with the rusty brown spores, but these ones all have this sort of blushy purplish lilac color. And there are innumerable species in here, including a number of species from our area. Also with an excellent key available, so that once we get into that section, we can start to identify the exact species. And a lot of those that are identified as a result of our work in the clubs, collecting these and getting them contributing to the paper. And finally, in this kind of direction, I can't go on without explaining Telemonia. Telemonia are the really difficult little brown mushrooms of Cortinarius. A recent paper came out with over 800 species. So, here is the limit. You can simply say these are Telemonia, but how would you recognize them? So they're Cortinarius. So you've got the rusty brown spores, got them terrestrial, but these are also hygrophanous. Hygrophanous means that they change color and texture, or color particularly, as they dry. So you might see a mushroom that looks very dark brown in the rain, but as you take it home, it dries out and it becomes cream. Or it might be zonally dry out. So you might see it has a very dark brown cap center, but sort of slightly paler brown around that, and then a very pale margin as it's drying. And if you put it in water, it might become dark brown again. And that's a really important feature of Telemonia, that they are hygrophanous. These also do not have a slippery cuticle, so they're just dry, hygrophanous, and abundant. But even here, if you start to geek out on them, you start to notice the differences. So in this area, you can start to see this one on the top right is actually really common in our area. It's a kind of a purplish brown mushroom. We get it in our coastal forests. I haven't got a solid name for it yet, but there are a few names. And it's definitely worth starting to recognize that you see the same thing, even if you don't have a name for it. Likewise, this one here. Look, you can see the dark center and the paler margin. And this one at the front, which is kind of orange. So there are variations, but it's just too hard to start to ID because so many of these names are not yet established. So I would say, just in this case, say that these are all Telemonia. Here's an example from the Mission Impossible paper where they were described. Just showing you how many of these things there are. Each one of these little tiles represents a section in Telemonia. That means that there's multiple species represented by each tile there. And, as a bit of inspiration, I did start to sequence these. And, one of my first collections that I sequenced from our last club foray a few years ago was, backwards, please. Anyway, it was a Cortinarius, came back as Cortinarius occidentalis sagitticidus. It's quite distinctive. It's a little orange Cortinarius. It sits by the side of the road. There's only 3 recorded collections, I think, in our area. And they were all by 2 of them are by gravel road. So keep your eyes out. If you are going to sequence, these things may be described. And it can be an opportunity for us to use names that are out there. I would never have been able to identify this from a book or a paper or in any other way. And yet now I can easily recognize it. So just to move to where Cortinarius is going now. And, the bad news is that things are getting a little more complicated, not in the sense of the mushrooms that are out there, but in the taxonomy and the approaches that we're taking. As belites have been split up, I'm not sure, have many of you been following how belite names have been changing? They've been getting many more genera have been identified within what used to be called belites. And in Cortinarius, a similar thing has been proposed. So over the last few years, we've been having lots of papers come out. And the papers are what's made it really interesting to work in quartz because we can start to name things. We've really got a lot of genetic information about them. But all these papers have started to reveal that there has been really unnatural groupings being placed in Cortinarius up till now. So things that were slippery, maybe looked similar, have been grouped together as a species concept, when in fact, we're finding that they are quite different genetically, that the lineages that occur naturally are not necessarily represented by the features that we've been identifying in the past. And so there's been a proposal to break up Cortinarius into 10 genera. And, in this case, the big paper that came out, I'm just clicking a few times here to try and propose that we have 10 new genera. And of those, 8 are in North America. So you can see them here that the majority of these still remain in Cortinarius. So the big pie on the right, the big pizza, shows the different genera as a result of this split. And the largest group still remains in genus Cortinarius. That's the pale kind of fawn color on the right. But there are another 9 genera, Thaxterogasta, Phlegmacium, Calinarius being the largest, that are being proposed by some of the leading Cortinariologists. Now, these kind of splits are a discussion. They're a debate. They're not necessarily sort of factually, this is the only way that we could split up or talk about species and genera. But a lot of the leading Cortinariologists in the world have been proposing this, this new look at the phylogenetics. And so I'm interested in exploring it and seeing how we could use it in our work. And then a lot of these names are starting to appear on our naturalist. So you'll see your Cortinarius observations might be suddenly changed to be called Phlegmatium or some other one of these subgenera, some of these other genera. So I think it's important for us to understand why that might be happening. So let's just have a look at what this means. Here's an example. So one of the subgenera here, this is one of the small ones, is called Orionarius. And here is what it actually would look like. So we have this new genus called Orionarius. So that used to be Cortinarius. And then underneath it, we have two subgenera, Callisti and Orionarius. So those are the subgenus level. And then under them, they've also put sections. So remember I showed you some of those groups earlier on, like Demosabe or, maybe the Purpuricenti, the purple ones, or the viscid ones. These will be actually subgenera or sections within the new genus. So these concepts are still useful for us, but they might be split into different genera. So what do you notice? Anyone notice anything in particular among all of these species? It was just no wrong answers here, by the way. Anything in common? They're not purple. Good one. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, I heard someone say yellowish. They have a yellowish look. There are a lot of orange. In fact, there are a lot of them, they're dry. So I think if we start to look at these more closely, in this case, it's a pretty good example that you can see common features in these species that are now proposed to be in a separate genus. And the same in another genus called Cysternarius, we see often staining yellow. So this is like the old Rubicundulus. You're seeing these kind of features, yellow staining. They also have cystidia, if you're interested in microscopy. And, they might have quite small spores. So again, here we have a new genus. It's a small genus, but there are features that we can start to recognize that make this hold together in a meaningful way. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So some of these new genera are still really, really large. So in the case here of comparing what we had in the past and what we have today, here is the old kind of concept that I talked about. These are the old sections you might see in a guidebook. And this is how the new sections might be split up. You can see that there's so many different sections within Cortinarius. It would be Cortinarius Demosabe, and then you'd have Phlegmatium, Glaucopus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're seeing a similar concept, but now they're split across different genera, which, in a plus side, it could make it more meaningful at the genus level, but on the negative, it's more names for us to remember. Lots of things are going to be transferred. Our guidebooks become out of date. And it can be more complicated for us to really recognize those features currently, because a lot of these genera are still really large and unwieldy. Just going to whiz through. I've just got a little last section here. I'm just going to whiz through some of the features of those genera so we can start to become familiar with them. So firstly, as I mentioned, Cortinarius, and that one isn't very useful to us for ID right now. There's just way too much variety within the genus Cortinarius. An example, although violaceous is the type, you've still got this species within that section. I mean, there's not a lot of familiarity between those two pictures, is there? The purple one and this. Yeah, that's not going to help me recognize a Cortinarius. So from my perspective, that genus is still very large and likely we'll see more splitting before we get to a sense of meaningful concepts. The next one, Phlegmatium. So this is a lot of the really beautiful kind of glaucopoid, pale, medium to large, grayish white, purple Cortinarius that will fall into this section, this genus. And I think this one is actually interesting because when I looked at the large number of species currently placed, I can start to see a familiarity. Sometimes the stipe is dry, so it's not going to be slippery like some of those species that I showed you earlier. And it includes things like Balteatus, kind of big, firm, meaty Cortinarius. And I think that as we get more familiar, this one might be able to identify as a genus, something that will help us out. Certainly the next one it's Calenarius. Calenarius, a lot of the most brightly colored and interesting from the perspective of they have very unique ecological niches. Calenarius are typically bulbopodiums and phlegmatiums, if you've studied Cortinarius in the past. Bulbopodiums have this really abrupt stipe, so they have a big bulbous base. And a nice thing that they do is if you have KOH, potassium hydroxide, they form bright reactions, colors. So if you put a little KOH on them, like in this photograph, this color here, it forms a really bright stain, magenta, red, sometimes, other colors. And this can really help us identify them. They're also quite rare in the sense that they form, they prefer specific ecological niches. So I found some in sort of old growth around the back of Mount Rainier. There's a lot that are associated with oak. And, in Europe, we have a very much rare habitat associated with these Cortinarius species. Cortinarius olympianus is one that I often refer to, associated with the Cortinarius genus. And then finally, the Thexterogaster. Thexterogaster are small to medium size. They have this often viscid cap with these brown colors, purple, green occasionally. But some of them have a bitter taste. And that's one group that I really encourage people to sort of lick and get to know, because the bitterness is such a really powerful identification feature. So Thexterogaster, I've been seeing these come across a lot on iNaturalist, and quite a number of our species that we find here are getting transferred from Cortinarius into Thexterogaster. This one, again, I think when we look at it and on the balance, it's going to be a useful genus for our identification purposes. So, I told you in the beginning that I'm not a scientist by background, but I've got very into the science of Cortinarius on my journey. So I just wanted to share a little bit more about what that was like for me, and, how people like you, everybody here, can really contribute to the science of Cortinarius. The reason that it's such an opportunity is because so much work has been done genetically, and so many of the sequences of these species I've showed you today are available on GenBank or among people who collaborate in this space. That means if you find something, there's a good chance that you'll know if it's new to science or if it's something that people are working on, and it can be immediately useful. Whereas in areas that little work has been done, you're just throwing one more barcode into a space that needs work later, and that can make it very difficult for people to get started. So what I did was I was actually up in the Alpine Lakes one day, and it was a kind of a dry summer. So I was at a seep, and I looked at the edge of the seeps, and there were these areas where we were getting these lots of beautiful red Cortinarius. I mean, red's a really interesting color out there, so it caught my eye, and I took some photographs and collections, both of these collections, and ended up turning out that this was a new species. And with a lot of support from professionals, from Joe Amirati and others working in the field, I was able to describe this mushroom. But I didn't know how to do that. It was just something that caught my eye. And, I went through the process of recording it. So how do we do that? Here's an example. I looked at the existing species that were known. So I found a red mushroom. I looked at other red mushrooms to see if this one was new or different. You can see when you look at this, it's much more slender. If I could go back, this one is quite stout, right? It's a bit redder, but if you look again, it's a little darker and it's more slender. So it's just that kind of gut observation that you need to get used to. And that's why it is easier if you start to focus on one genus, because you get more familiar with the look and feel of the species in our area. If you become a generalist, it's very hard to fine tune your eye to that degree. So I was lucky. I'd liked these red mushrooms, and so I noticed this. And when it was sequenced, what you can see here is that it grouped separately. The barcodes for my collections were clearly different to the barcodes for the existing species. And this here you can see was the existing barcodes for Cortinarius neosanguineus, whereas here you have the barcodes for the collections that I'd made. But as it happened, I really only knew one location where this thing occurred. And while you can describe from a single location, it's not the best practice. It's really better to have, a broader genetic set, more examples to draw on, so that I could describe with more confidence what it would actually look like for somebody else who might find it. Luckily, we'd had a microflora project go on, and several other folks had also collected it. This here was a species, a collection that we actually just found on iNat. There it was. Somebody else had called theirs neosanguineus with a barcode from Alaska. Turned out to be the same thing. So I ended up with 3 collections, one from Joe Amirati, one from another community scientist in Alaska who just happened to take part in the Mica Blitz, and then a third collection from Alaska and my collections from Washington. So it's just really an interesting example of how just people getting out there in the field, taking collections and having them sequenced starts to come together and put the puzzle pieces in place for us to be able to describe a new species, even something as brightly colored and visible as this, which, you know, most of us would assume would have been described by now. And interestingly, members of your club have actually also started to collect this. Jeanette has collected this species, which it turns out is not quite understood either. So we're currently working on this, which is just really cool because her collection was just beautifully documented. If you are going to go to the effort of collecting things, it's really excellent. Plus, do it anyway, but even more helpful if you can keep records of what you've collected if you think you have something unique or unusual. So this is actually gone for secondary sequencing, and hopefully we can get some experts to work on it. So in conclusion, there's lots of opportunities for you to do this kind of sequencing. I think that the club here is already advanced. I've heard in your kind of work in this area, but I'd really encourage you to get out there for the fall and summer Myco Blitz. This year, I think you can get 10 or more sequences done individually for free. And just a plug, if you see any of these red-gilled Cortinarius, there's a real need for more data on them. So if you wouldn't mind, you know, throwing those in your dryer with a voucher, every single data point is going to be useful because we're not yet clear on the distribution of which species that we have in our area. And they're currently just so much variety that it's incredibly valuable. I believe that Cortinarius has been prioritized as a sort of a genus in the old sense of interest. So again, just a real plug to get involved. Is this club officially taking part in this Mica Blitz, or are you doing your own sequencing at the moment? Yeah, if not, let me know. I'm coordinating with PSMS and a few other folks, trying to help people participate. If the club chooses to sponsor any sequencing, it's like $3 a sequence. It's really affordable. And then you can adjust the dates so that if the dates that have been set for the collection are not quite right for your forays or your field trips, you can adjust a little bit and make it work. And I think that's what we're hoping to do. So yeah, really great opportunities and just more chance for us to start to fill in the gaps in the guidebook. Personally, I'm putting my court collections up on NA Courts. I'm very far behind. I've got another 50 I need to put up. But here you will find verified, genetically sequenced examples of different species. I've got, I think, 75 or 76. And I'd also recommend you look at the Mycoflora website, Myco Quebec. They have excellent records of Cortinarius. Not entirely, you know, for our region, they tend to be a bit more for the Northeast, but there is some overlap. And so it's really useful to look up their collections as well. And, you know, my vision here, that guidebook is pretty spotty right now for Cortinarius, but hopefully in the future, either digitally or in print, we'll have a much better set of sequences of the species in our area. So we'll be able to name more. You know, my goal, let's have 50 names on our table in our fall shows. Let's be able to identify 10, 20, 30 species and get towards that future state where we have all 430 named and understood. Thank you. There are spring Cortinarius as well, a lot. If you go up to Blue Up Pass, I go up every year. They're amazing leprosopes. There's a snow melt Mycoflora that has several species. So no, it's not only fall. And there are actually a large variety of beautiful spring Demosipes. There's a lot of what we used to call the Simamonius group. There are a lot out at that time, and the Crotius group. So yeah, plenty to do in spring. Vernus spring, it's Vernus obviously means spring. The Cortinarius Vernus group is poorly understood, and I think Gerard Moradi has asked for any sequences of that. So you know, plenty to do in spring. It starts to, yeah, I have some of them. I have Anomaly up there, and I have Leprosopy. Yeah, so some of them are up there. The genera, the proposed genera, no. And I have another talk that I'll be doing about the genera in a bit more detail that it'll be online, I think, for San Francisco in May. It's difficult because, you know, it is a debate. Any kind of taxonomy is a discussion or an argument, almost a proposed argument within the scientific community for how people see we should group things. And I think as outsiders or people who are consumers of those taxonomies, we sometimes think that they're set in stone and there's a right answer, though we are inexorably heading towards truth. It's not necessarily the case. There are options. As we have more data, we can divide things up differently. So I'm invested in this initiative to you know, for the different genera, simply because I'm contributing to a framework that, you know, I'm indebted to the framework of the workers in this field, but I'm not in a position to say if this is, you know, the way we're going to be in 10 years' time. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So officially, then none except violaceous. I have eaten. Yeah, the question was of the purple Cortinarius. You know, I showed the 4 Salor and the purpuricenti. That's the slippery one that bruises, and then Triganus, which is the one that has the brownish young girls, and Camphoratus, the one that's quite smelly, which were edible. Officially, of those, none are edible. But we need to differentiate them from, you know, maybe a bluet, which is edible. So I think that's why being aware of these is useful. I have eaten Banduserensis or Sidellii. I'm alive. I don't know if I would recommend it, but, you know, you can sample some of those yourself. If you feel that risk is not high, but why? You know, the counter argument is always, these are not necessarily delicious. So as an experiment, you could eat a twig. This is maybe the equivalent, but you know, they're not known to be toxic. No, it's renal failure. So it's a, you know, hepatitis, like, you know, you go yellow, it's a slower acting toxin, but it's not, we know the areas that the aurulane is, they don't look like those purple ones at all. So if you looked at those species like aurulanatus, sorry, I might have it slightly wrong, and rubellus, they're brownish, reddish brown, species that do not look at all like, and they're in a different section entirely. So, yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, so I mean, it's one of the best questions to ask. And I think if we had a panel up here with Noah Siegel on one side, we'd have a vigorous argument, because he's not of a fan of some of the splitting for that very reason. You know, you have to split to a very great degree to get to a meaningful cluster. That said, the ones that I was showing you are meaningful clusters and they're genetically supported. That's why I pulled those out. So the Dermosobi are that feature of the brilliant water-soluble red gills and the slightly fuzzy fibery head. It's called fiber derm skin head, slightly like skin-like cap. And the cylindrical sac, they have a certain look. those are genetically a very strong subgenus. Some people have proposed, it's been proposed as a genus in the past because it's so distinctive. So that's a good one. We can work on that. Anomaly, also really distinctive. They have a slightly fuzzy cap, often a little yellow veil bands. They're pale. I often think of them as little lilac mice, and they're delicate. Some people love them. And that's really distinctive. I don't see those features outside, maybe a few telemonia, but telemonia don't have the fuzzy cap. So there we have. So I think we should hang our hats on those areas where it does work and let the experts solve the big, the terrain of these numerous things that fall in between that might share a characteristic, like, hey, there's viscidity here. Well, let's not get distracted. There's enough work to do in the mixacium or in the areas that it does work. That's what I'm certainly doing. But that, you're asking exactly the right question. Yes. I'm actually working on 4, and it's not a solo job for me. I mean, I might do it's more like administrative work, administrative biology. Describing, it's not like glorious. You're not wearing a cape. Yes, I could name it, but I ended up deciding naming it doesn't make me super excited because science has a certain protocols. It's like it's a practice, it's a culture. And so you don't want to rock the boat too much. I don't want to go call it, I think some people did call a mushroom smurfdom or something, but I'm not quite there yet. I need to get my ego a bit more in gear before I really break out the box. So I was looking for names that fit the practice and can help people recognize them. So, like if it's blue, I want to call it blue one. The name I chose for the previous, the species I did name, it's in the protocol of similar sanguineae so that it fits in the scientific practice. However, people do have fun with them. And at some point I, touch wood, hope I do get to the point where I can have a lot of fun naming a mushroom. Any more questions? Please keep them coming. I really enjoy it. Anyone else? Well, I hope I've encouraged some of you to collect more Cortinarius this fall. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for that talk. That was fascinating, a really deep dive on a beautiful and interesting mushroom that a lot of us might overlook while we're out there looking for chanterelles. So thanks for coming down and talking to us. So that concludes our general meeting. We'll go ahead and there's Rose. Go ahead and do our raffle, but otherwise stick around a little bit if you want to keep looking at the books we have and that sort of thing. Otherwise, we hope to see you at our spring festival a week from Saturday. Thank you so much. Have a good night.